Meeting has started.
Good morning and welcome to everyone. Thank you very much for joining this conversation on Africa's youth voices in terms of having this conversation around the youth stages. I am Jean-Paul Adon. I'm the Director for Policy Monitoring and Advocacy in the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa. And we are delighted to continue the very important conversation which touches on the African Union theme of the year on justice for Africans and people of African descent, including through reparations. And in today's discussion, we really want to hear young people's perspectives, in particular around the subject of how we can learn from the past, how we address the subject of the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and what this means as well for the nature of African economies, which unfortunately remain predominantly extractive, and what it means as well for African institutions. And how do we use this understanding of the past to change the future? How do we address the systemic inequalities that are legacies of colonialism while being able to implement Agenda 2063, the ambition that has been expressed very clearly by Africans in terms of the transformation of their economies, as well as the global initiative and momentum towards attaining the Sustainable Development Goals, the means by which we address the systemic poverty which continues to be the bane of global development. In an African context, first of all, it is important that we consider the structural issues that are associated with the history of slavery and of colonialism. I think for young people, and quite a few young people have actually told me to say that when they look at the issues of Africa's past, they pale in comparison to the challenges that we are currently facing in terms of bad governance, in terms of corruption, in terms of issues that African leaders should be dealing with in the immediate. And there is sometimes a tendency to place less emphasis on the historical aspect because there is a bigger focus on what African governments should do themselves. And I think that both things can potentially be true. There is at the same time a systemic issue which has to be addressed as part of the legacy of colonialism, as well as strengthening institutions, strengthening governance, strengthening the modes of operation of African governments for effectiveness to be able to achieve true sustainable development. If we look at African economies at the point of independence, independence was a political objective which was achieved after many years of struggle by independence leaders across the continent and led as well by the Organization of African Unity, which of course preceded the African Union. The nature of independence, which was political, did not change the structural nature of African economies, where extractive economies set up by colonial powers were focused on the extraction of raw materials and the export of commodities to meet the overall goals of industrialization of the center, of the metropoles of these colonial powers. At the point of independence, the majority of African countries persisted in these economic models because they needed to. Survival meant that they needed to keep the flows of investment coming, and that meant continuing in terms of providing the resources that were earning them foreign currency, which allowed their economies to continue to grow. And what we have seen in the years post-independence is that there has actually been a cycle always of boom and bust in terms of the growth of African exports, which has driven often some of the highest levels of growth in the world. But these are unfortunately not sustained and then are usually accompanied at some point by a fall in those commodity prices, and where therefore a lot of those gains are quite quickly lost. And at the same time, to be able to finance investment in infrastructure and in other sectors of the economy, including some attempts at diversification, the rates of African debt have increased. And in many cases, that debt has been raised using the support of former colonial powers. And in the context of the perpetuation of this extractive model, we have seen that the cost of servicing debt rise over time, while at the same time the investment that has accompanied has not allowed the actual structural transformation of those economies. And therefore perpetuating this cycle of boom and bust in terms of the export of commodities without the establishment of sustainable national or regional value chains. Hence, it is important that we look at the nature of African economies in the context of colonialism. Secondly, in terms of the institutions across Africa, again, the majority of institutions that were created under colonialism were focused on the protection of assets that were associated with the colonial powers. Many of these institutions were ill-adapted to the socioeconomic environments of African countries, were ill-adapted to the ethnic makeup of those countries, and often completely divorced as well from the actual geography of those countries. While some countries have succeeded more successfully than others in terms of addressing some of these institutions, overall, the nature of those institutions tend to remain extractive rather than inclusive, including in terms of empowering, for example, young people to be able to fully participate in the economy through investment in skills, but also in terms of the continuation of gender inequality. The weakness of institutions across Africa has also meant that the governance of natural resources has been suboptimal. And this has contributed enormously to the continuation of illicit financial flows, which then further undermines the capacity of the state to invest in sustainable development. The illicit financial flows from Africa are estimated at close to $90 billion per annum. And so very, very simply, if we look at the question of the legacy of slavery and of colonialism through an economic lens and in terms of institutions, we can see that African countries have not been able to assert control over their economic and financial flows. And as a consequence, there has been insufficient investment into the transformation of their economies. Therefore, for 2025, in the current conversation around justice for Africans and people of African descent, we need to consider the means by which we can change the narrative. How do we empower Africa to have this conversation around justice for Africans and people of African descent? And how do we address the subject of reparations in a way which does allow African countries to take control over their economic and financial flows, and therefore to invest in the sustainable future that is embodied within Agenda 2063. So this is the question before us, and we very much look forward to the perspectives from young people around this subject, and recognizing that all solutions need to be put onto the table with a view to identifying those that are the most practical. Allow me to say that perhaps one of the most durable and transformative aspects will be to really reinforce African institutions, strengthening the capacity of African countries to raise their own resources through domestic resource mobilization, and therefore address the uncertainty in terms of the predictable access to finance, which, as we have seen, is very much at the forefront of current affairs. I've been very pleased to be able to share these brief introductory remarks with you on behalf of Undersecretary General Christina Duarte, and I very much look forward to continuing the discussion. And over to you, Oliver, and thank you very much for inviting me to share this moment with you.
Thank you so much, Director, for that great introductory remark. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please proceed.
Good
morning.
I want to thank Director for giving us a very great insight on our African history and also giving a way forward in his very brief remark. And I would like to go in the next session, which is our panel discussion. But before I proceed, I want to introduce myself. My name is Mutesi Oliver. I'm the Vice President of the Pan-African Youth Union representing East African region, and I'm the moderator of this session. But before I go into the moderation, I would like to start with a quote. It's by Frantz Fanon. He says that each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. As young people of Africa, I think our forefathers fought colonialism. Ours is hold accountable, those who did these very terrible actions on our people. So with that quote, I would like to call on stage our panelists to come and introduce themselves, each 1 minute, so that we can proceed, we can go into the discussion. May I call VP Bora, Comrade Bora, could you please come and introduce yourself? VP Bora, we can hear you. Your mic is off. Your mic is off. We can't hear you. We still can't hear you. As we having VP Bora sort out that technical issue, can we have Madam Yevola to come and introduce yourself? We shall come back to you, VP Bora.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Yovela Debesai. I am of Eritrean descent. I'm based here in Washington, D.C., most recently having served as a business development research analyst for a development consulting firm. I come from a background of international development and economics, while also simultaneously doing diaspora engagement work, particularly with the Eritrean diaspora, alongside the Eritrean permanent mission to the United Nations. It is a pleasure to be speaking with you all this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're located. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. I would like to call on Honorable Fuad. Could you please come and introduce yourself? And also turn on your mic, your camera. Fuad.
VP, can you hear me? This is Bora.
Yes, no, perfect. Can come in.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Sorry about that. My name is Bora Kamwanya. I'm from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and I am the Vice President in charge of Diaspora Affairs at the Pan-African Youth Union. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Can we have Honorable Fuad?
He seems to have dropped off from the meeting, so maybe if you could move on to Alex.
Okay, can we have Alex? Alex, are you there?
Yes.
Please turn on your camera and also introduce yourself. Alex,
Hello.
are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Alex Amaukinodia, an entrepreneur from Kenya. Professionally, I am a project manager. Thank you.
You're welcome. So we will move swiftly to our discussion today. The theme of the day is about learning from the past, transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, extractive economies, and institutions of Africa. As young people, we all believe that the colonialism, slave trade, and everything that came with that affected young people, affected our continent. So as young people, we need to also take part of finding solution to hold accountable, also to make sure we bring our continent up to speed to see how we can get out of these very horrible situations that they placed us in. So I will start with VP Bora as the VP of the region diaspora representing Pan African Youth Union. Why is it important for young Africans to understand the legacy of transatlantic slave trade and colonialism in today's context?
Thank you, VP Mutesi. I hope my microphone does not give up on me. Thank you so much. I think it's very important, understanding the legacy of the slave trade and colonialism has, in my opinion, three purposes. The first one will be to remember the past, and then to understand the present, and of course, to shape the future. For over 400 years, African people were captured, sold, and shipped across oceans. Millions of lives have been destroyed, families torn apart, languages, cultures, traditions, all of those were suppressed and lost. And then after that, after slavery came colonialism, another chapter of exploitation. Our lands were carved up by foreign powers, our resources were extracted, our education system, our social structures, and even our sense of self were manipulated to serve the interests of others. And I agree with you. Why should that matter to us today? I mean, as young Africans, it's simply because the consequence did not vanish when slavery was abolished or when independence was declared. Today's poverty, corruption, underdevelopment, and even internal conflicts, many of these are rooted in a system that was built during slavery and the colonial rule. And it is our role to understand that history so we can make sense of today's inequality. And again, here is not to blame anyone, but to build better and ask for fair compensation because it is due. When we see foreign companies owning our mines or our leaders signing unfair deals, we must ask who benefits and why is it still happening. Knowing our past, also help us reclaim our identity. Too often African cultures and languages are dismissed as backward or irrelevant. And sometimes they will refer to our languages as dialects. That is a colonial mindset. So our history is full of powerful societies, thinkers, inventors, warriors even. And there was a very beautiful movie about the warriors of Benin that was in theaters, I think, last year. But we are not a people without our history. We are people whose history was buried. It is time to dig it up, to wear it with pride. But when I'm saying that we have to wear with pride, our history, it doesn't mean that we must accept what had happened. We must ask for reparation, and we must refuse to be subjugated to today's laws and dogma. Because remember that what is legal is not necessarily just. And understanding the legacy of slavery and colonialism also connects us to our brothers and sisters in the diaspora, in the Americas, in the Caribbean, and even in Europe. They too carry the scars of their history. And when we understand what was done to all of us, we can begin to stand together to build something stronger through Pan-Africanism. And this is me speaking as Pan-African Youth Union, in order to share and to discuss our shared struggle. Finally, I think that learning our history gives us the tools to resist neocolonialism, and that is very important, which is the modern version of control through debt, foreign aid, and media manipulation. It teaches us to think critically, to question who writes our textbooks, who owns our banks, who controls our media, and who sets the price of our natural resources. So to every young African, the story of slavery and colonialism is not just about chains and colonizers. It's about how we got here. It's about why some nations are rich and others are poor. It's about why we must rise with knowledge, unity, and of course with purpose. And lately, I've heard that almost all the so-called generational wealth in the United States are linked to either colonialism and exploitation. And we are not victims, we are survivors. And if we know our history, we will build a future that honors our ancestors, empowers the next generation. I think that's the message I would share as Vice President of the Pan-African Union in charge of the diaspora.
Thank you, VP Bora. This one goes to Yovola. In the meantime, I would request our online audience, if you have any question, keep putting it in on the chat. We'll come back and you note the person you're going to be directing it to. We have a technical team that is going to help us note it down. Then we'll read it later for answers. To you, Madam Yovela, about colonial legacy and structural reforms. How can young Africans be more involved in reforming political, educational, and economic institutions built on colonial legacies?
Thank you so much for this question, Madam VP. Hello again to everybody. I think this is a very important question, and it would not be right to answer this question without acknowledging the current efforts that are being taken place by young Africans who are actively becoming more involved in regards to reforming politics, in reforming educational reform, having and taking a stake and having a presence and being proactive and vocal about any displeasement of economic institutions and the existing work that is taking place. Most recently, as of 2-3 weeks ago, at the United Nations headquarters in New York City, we had the hosting of the ECOSOC Youth Forum, which is the largest body of young people hosted at the United Nations. And the representation of African youth, African diaspora youth in particular, was unprecedented. The work that is being taken place on the ground, the grassroots mobilization that's taking place by young Africans should be highlighted, as these are efforts that are actively and will be continuing to take place for young people to take a voice and speak on moving beyond the current colonial legacies that take place in our home countries in Africa. This reform continues to take place as we continue to have youth representation take place at the table and in the footnotes in regards to designing policy, conducting research, and disrupting these narratives that are currently taking place. But it's very, very clear that young people are not waiting for that seat at the table. They are forcing their presence to be taking place at the table. Many of our institutions, whether that is through education, political structures, or economic systems, unfortunately still reflect the colonial legacies of the past, whether that is through centralized powers that are taking place, extractive economic models in regards to the exporting of raw materials, and outdated knowledge hierarchies that reflect the education systems of those that are abroad and not of those systems domestically. And we see that young people are continuing to actively transform these measures across the continent and being the change they wish to see. Currently, we even have the youngest minister on the continent serving within the Parliament of Namibia at the age of 27. Efforts of young people and of youth engagement is not simply a hope of the future, a hope of surpassing the current colonial legacies, but are a current reality of the present. And it's important to also highlight as these efforts are continuing that these efforts move towards becoming more and more localized. Decolonizing and removing these colonial legacies of institutions will naturally become more and more localized. And there's not more localization and more understanding of cultural context than that of the young people who have these existing realities on a day-to-day basis. So that representation and those efforts will naturally happen as we continue to move towards more localized efforts. And this will continue to mean the importance of trusting young people, of trusting the African youth to lead within proximity, as they have the cultural context, and as the youth naturally have the confidence and conviction needed to surpass the colonial legacies of our current systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, my dear sister. I will move to Alex about historical justice and memory. Alex, I believe you come from Kenya. Kenya is one of the countries that stood up against colonialism through Mau Mau Rebellion. What are some of the hidden and untold stories of African resistance during the slave trade and colonial period that young people you'd know about from your perspective? Someone who lives in a country that resisted so much colonialism. What do you think about this? Alex?
Yes.
Yes, are you there?
Hope you can all hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you.
But you can keep your camera on.
Yes. Some of.
Yes.
Okay. I hope you can see.
It's on and off, but we can move. You can speak as you bring the camera comes back. Alex? Alex?
Yes. Hello. Can you now see me?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay. Some of the hidden.
Can we come back to you, Alex?
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Let's come back to you. Can we go to Fuad? Is Fuad back? What? Okay, I'll go to VP Bora. Bora, as someone who comes from Congo, we all know how bad colonialism is still deep-seated in Congo. It's even some of the challenges that DRC is going through, being one of the wealthiest countries on earth, but it still has issues like war. It has issues like pandemics and all. How have colonial structures and extractive economy models shaped Africa's current development challenges and opportunities? I believe you're one of the people who comes from Goma, who has seen how bad colonialism has treated the people of DRC up to this time. What do you think about this?
Thank you. Thank you, VP Mukesi. You're right, yes. And thank you for acknowledging the current situation in Goma, where more than 2.5 billion people are still under M23 RDF occupation right now. And all this, you're absolutely right. It comes also from colonialism. When we talk about development in Africa, we cannot ignore the past because it is still very much present. And in Goma, you will see it. You have so many NGOs bringing development aid, so many organizations, and I'm going to use this word, white saviorism. It's very much present. So colonial powers didn't come to Africa to build nations. I think we need to stop thinking that there was a nation building idea behind that. They came to extract wealth. The colonial economy was built like a pipeline. Raw materials like gold, rubber, cotton, oil flowed out of Africa to Europe and other places, while manufactured goods flowed back into Africa. It was never designed for African to benefit. It was designed to enrich colonial empires. And in Africa, we are both the plantation and the market. So how does it affect us now? Well, firstly, many African countries still rely heavily on exporting raw material. Our economies are vulnerable to global price shocks, and because we are still exporting what we don't process, a drop in oil or copper prices can cripple a national budget, right? And why? Because colonialism discouraged industrialization and investment in local production. The model continues today in a different form. We can call it neo-colonialism. And we saw recently a war in Ukraine starved people in Chad. How does that make sense? Second, colonial borders were created artificial states, forcing together ethnic groups that had little in common while splitting others apart. And you can see today that it has fueled political instability, conflict, and also weak national identities. All those problems that make development harder and governance almost impossible. And this leads to, today again, ill-intentioned neighbors trying to reshape Africa's geography for the selfish interest. And third, colonial governments did not invest in people. They invested in controls. Schools were limited. And if I can take the example of DRC, on June 30th, 1960, only 17 people had graduated from university. Infrastructure was built only to support extractions, like roads from mines to ports, not between communities, because a united people was a dangerous people for the colonial power. Today, many African countries are still catching up on education, healthcare, and infrastructure gaps that should have been addressed generations ago. However, I'm not just here to tell you bad story or how our history was darkened by colonial power. With those challenges, we also have opportunities. As you know, we are rich in natural resources, and we have a very young and thriving population. If we shift from extractive models to value-added production, processing our own minerals, growing our own industries, we can build real wealth. Countries like Burkina Faso and Ghana are already trying to move into that direction by encouraging local manufacturing and tech innovation. And if I'm not mistaken, President Mzee of Uganda told us months back that Uganda is also moving towards that. So there are changes.
VP Bora? VP Bora?
I believe his connection might have dropped off.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Oh, perfect. So I was saying the United Nations were created in 1945. Perhaps some people are not liking what I'm saying somewhere in the internet and they're trying to shut me down. I didn't come here to live long life. I just came here to impact. So the United Nations was created in 1945, 46. African countries joined 15 years later for the most of us. And you can already see that we came and we start playing the game with rules that we never set. So we have a chance to redesign the system that was never made for us. With digital tools, youth-led movement, and growing Pan-African unity, we can break out of colonial economies, economic partners, and create models that actually serve our people and not just the global market. So to do that, we need bold leadership, and that should insist on that. Regional cooperation, and seeing the way that we're having wars in Africa, we really need to insist on regional cooperation. Investment in education and technology. It is time that the policies that we have protect African interests first. We need to understand that the legacy of extractions still shape our economy, and we don't need to repeat the same mistakes under new names. It is time also for us African people and African countries to stop being brotherly to everyone. Your brother does not give you a Bible. Your brother gives you a tool or tools to develop yourself, as the Lord commanded. 2 Timothy 1:7 and Matthew 25:14-30. I'm not a priest. I'm just saying. In short, colonialism built a system to attract, not to develop. But now we have a choice to reform those systems, to reclaim our economies, and also to reimagine development on our own terms. And I do not believe that the leaders of today are the one who will be able to make that change. It is our time, and it is important for us to take the lead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll come back to you, Alex. As I said earlier, Kenya is one of the countries that resisted colonialism through the Mau Mau Rebellion and reforms. I would like to inquire or ask, what are some of the hidden and untold stories of African resistance during the slave trade and colonial period that young people should know about?
Hello, I hope you all can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, I'll start with Kenya is one of the countries that slave trade. We have some historical monuments and historical markets where slaves are being sold. For example, in Mombasa, we have the Kengele market. that's a place where the bell was being used. When the slaves arrived, the bell was being rung to inform the Europeans and the buyers that the slaves have just arrived. And we also have some monuments at Ukambani, where in the 90s, the Kambas resisted so much against the forced labor. We also have the Laikipia, where, the resistance also, the resistance also caused the movement of some tribes. In Kenya, we have the 42 tribes, where during the slave trade, there was the splitting of the tribes. I hope you all can hear me.
Yes, we can.
It caused the splitting of different tribes into different regions. For example, the Maasai had to move to Tanzania at that time, during that time, and it also caused the regional cooperation breakdown. Hello, you all can see?
Yes, we
We
can
also
hear.
have the Makatilili Wamenza story. He was a guerrilla leader who fought with the British against the slave trade. He was among the Kenyans who were used in building the railways, which connected Kenya with the Uganda at that time. And currently, the Kenyan youths are still fighting against the slave trade, since there is the neocolonialism. There is still neocolonialism, and as Kenyans and Kenyan youths, we are still fighting against it, both online and in schools. We are also advocating for prioritizing of cash crops and in various agro-processing industries, since we also had some advantages of the colonialism, since there was some introduction of some crops like coffee and tea.
All right. So we'll come back to you, Alex. I want to go back to Yovela. About the extractive economies and sustainable development, how can we rehabilitate the Africa continent free trade area to break away from colonial patterns of trade and resource exploitation?
Okay, so thank you so much for that question. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is a very historic and powerful opportunity in order for Africa to reimagine their place in regards to the global trade systems, as this will contribute with the continued ratification and implementation of the treaty towards a continent-wide hub of three major factors of regional value addition, digital commerce, and industrial collaboration. But this will not happen solely and in silo. I believe it's very important for efforts to and interests simultaneously exist with the power of simultaneous regional bodies and utilizing these regional bodies that do actively exist towards further mobilizing the impact and implementation of the free trade agreement. We see that with current active steps that are taking place with regional bodies that do exist on a political level, economic level, and a social level, with the presence of ECOWAS, for example, and for ECA. These regional bodies do exist and can help towards mobilizing and further facilitating the implementation of the free trade agreement, and are tools that can be used to accelerate the intentions and efforts of the trade agreement. It is very important that we have the implementation of the trade agreement, as it plays a major role in the importance of cross-border knowledge sharing across the continent. It simply doesn't make sense that there is a delay in regards to producing trade, immigration amongst nations that are borders, that are neighbor states, when that isn't the case when it comes to these efforts with nations abroad, outside of the continent. We see, though, that these current efforts are taking place even among the diaspora and internally, with the presence of diaspora professionals, with the presence of youth-led trade incubators and women entrepreneurs, must continue to be emphasized, highlighted, and prioritized in order to help further accelerate the structural integration of the trade agreement as it continues to roll out. And when we see the further implementation of the trade agreement and the further prioritization of internal and intra-African trade, this will naturally and subconsciously lead to a removal and a release of the colonial patterns that take place currently in regards to trade routes and resource mobilization on the continent, and further internal and intra-trade taking place on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam Yovela. I would like to go back to Alex. Alex, what's the role of youth in reshaping Africa's economy right now, particularly industries and energy transition, minerals and green technology? Alex, can you hear me? Can I repeat the question? Okay. Do you want me to repeat the question? Sorry? I repeat?
Can you repeat the question?
What is the role of youth in reshaping Africa's economic future, particularly in industries, energy transition, minerals, and green technology?
You're muted. I believe his connection was poor, Olivia.
Okay,
and he has dropped off the call.
Okay, I'll move to Bora. Bora, how can we ensure that African history is told by Africans and told accurately in schools across the continent and diaspora? As someone who comes from DRC and so many terrible things that have happened, if you could read the King Leopold's Ghost, there's a book called King Leopold's Ghost. I mean, there's so many stories that are really horrible. How do you ensure that African history is told by Africans and told accurately in schools across the continent and diaspora? Because most of young people don't know these things and been kept away from literature, and they don't know what happened. And if you do not know that history, you can't determine the future. So what do you think should be done?
Thank you. You know, telling the African history accurately and making sure it's taught by African is not just a cultural project, in my opinion. I think it's a political, educational, and even a psychological mission. Let me bring you back to 2020 during the pandemic. The African Union Diaspora Youth Initiative here in Brussels. So it's the body that was linked to the AU mission in Brussels, and for all of Europe. We were looking for ways to entertain African young people in the diaspora during the pandemic. We understood that people were feeling lonely and at times bored. So we decided to launch a game on the social media, Instagram, every Friday night. And the game is called Mock, which I've made into a board game. So it was a quiz, an online quiz every Friday night where I was the host, so I'll be hosting and I'll be asking questions on Africa. And we did realize something, that Africans in the diaspora love the continent and they love the country of origin, but they do not know the continent and they do not know the country of origin. And so we're quite appalled and surprised, but also not so surprised, given that we're not taught African history in schools in Europe or even in America. And to go even further, we are having a hard time finding resources to educate ourselves on that. And so for too long, our history has been told through the eyes of outsider, colonial powers, foreign textbooks, and distorted narratives that painted Africa as a continent of darkness, war, and poverty. And I think there's even a book about my country called The Heart of Darkness. But Africa's story is much deeper. It's much richer. And it's time that we take ownership of it. And we have amazing authors telling our history in French, in English, in Swahili, in Spanish, in Portuguese, in Wolof, in Soninke, beautiful ways, but without shying away from how brutal it was at time. And we must decolonize our education system. I think that's the first thing that we need to do. Many African schools still use curriculum that were inherited from colonial times or are modeled after the Western system. And this often minimize pre-colonial African civilization, most of the time, the resistance movement, or even the contribution of African thinkers, women, and revolutionaries. And I did my primary school in Belgium and high school, actually, and university. And so I've never learned about the role of Belgium in Congo. Never. Never learned about Lumumba. Never learned about the role of the Belgian parliament or even King Leopold. But I did remember every time I would be passing by Matonge, which is the Congolese or African district in Brussels, I would always see the statutes of Leopold. But I was never told who Leopold was and what he did. And in the same way, our history has been put aside with a purpose, so that we do not revolt, so that we do not ask what is ours. Secondly, we need to invest in African research and scholarship. And this also brings me, and I'm sorry, Belgium, but I'm in Belgium and that's what I know better. There is a museum here in Belgium called the African Museum in Tervuren. And it is very expensive for an African to go and spend one day in that museum and do some research. They have all the informations about our continent, the soil, the communities before they arrived, the communities how they arrived, the systems that they installed. But when an African wants to come and study whatever is here, it's very, very complicated. So that means that we need to fund the universities, historical institutes, and we need publishing houses that prioritize African voices. When an African historian writes, interprets, and publish our stories, we create narratives that are rooted in lived experiences, not outside the judgments. I think it's very important to see the difference between our lived experience and the judgment. And on this, it is important to actually facilitate human mobility on the continent so that each and every one of us can be the thread to reinforce Africa. And my mother was telling me that back in the day, she's not that old, but back in the day, African mobility was easier. You would have kids from Algeria in Congo, from Morocco in Congo, Congolese in Kenya. We even have a lot of Guineans and Senegalese in Congo today. Third, the storytelling. Storytelling must go beyond textbooks. We must use documentaries, theaters, podcasts, social media, literature, music, and films to bring our history to life. I mentioned this big Hollywood movie that was in theater last year. All the platforms, I will not name them because they don't pay me to name them, all the platforms need to be used because those are powerful tools to educate youth in ways that are engaging and relatable. When you hear somebody made 20 million US dollars on a social media platform last year, you have to ask yourself, how do we use the same platform? Make money, yes, but also educate our people. We must include the diaspora in this process. because African descent in the Americas, the Caribbean, Europe, are also part of this story. Through slavery, colonialism, resistance, and the cultural rebirth. In Congo, we have what we call the Congolese rumba, which is actually a rumba that is copied from the Cuban rumba, but the Cuban rumba actually came from Congo through the slavery. So a lost identity was preserved in Cuba and then came back to Congo again. So that's why it's very important for us to ensure that we include the diaspora in this. And we need policies to support this. Government should mandate African history as a core subject in schools, from primary to university level, but not just in Africa, but also in Europe. Because as European leaders like to say, we have a shared history. Shared maybe, but there was a slave and a master. But we do have a shared history. And that's why it's important to also teach your responsibility as European, as American, your responsibility in our common history. It means that we need to remind every child that before colonization, we had powerful empires, advanced knowledge system, arts, governance, and philosophy. We need to teach them about the Moors in Italy and Spain. We need to teach them that the continent's future lies not in copying others, but in knowing who we are. In the end, history and knowing history is power. And if we don't tell our own history, someone else will. And as you know, it's always the one who says the story that is right. But they will never tell the story in our favor. So it is our time to write it. It is our time to empower young people to write their own history. And we have to remember that we need to make sure that African children, wherever they are, they grow up knowing that they come from greatness. That was me trying to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As we are moving to open our conversations to our online audience, I would like to ask Yovela about, I think you've heard about this book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. You've heard about it. So my question to you, how can we revelate the African, what are the practical steps can Africa take to shift from extractive economies to inclusive sustainable development models? Because now we have known Europe and the West, they have been part of this problem. So what are the steps we need to take as African young people to shift from these extractive economies, from being taking minerals, shipping all the minerals to Europe and being left with nothing, to sustainable development models?
Thank you so much for that question. This is honestly the golden ticket question, I feel like, when it regards to all the conversations we're having today. I think even before answering this question, it's very critical to pinpoint the reality that the current extractive models that exist across the continent are very intentional and was not accidental. It was never never designed for African prosperity. It was solely designed to export, to exploit, and to exclude. And unfortunately, the repercussion of this can still be felt today. But this shift to more inclusive, sustainable economic models really goes down to self-sovereignty and self-sufficiency within the continent, with the importance of being able to have ownership of value chains, investments in our own powerful human capital, as we are leveraged to see by 2050, 1 in 4 people in the world will be young Africans, and the building of regional and continental resilience. The current shift in inclusive and sustainable development models is almost forcibly taking place when we see the removal of the U.S. Agency for International Development, for instance, and other dependency agencies of the West being removed and removing themselves from the continent. This is forcibly forcing a lot of countries on the continent to rewrite their budgets with rerouting of fundings from internal sources to fund and future develop economic mobility internally. The traces of the negativity of the dependency on development agencies abroad has even been highlighted by many within, for instance, former Minister of Ghana, as a wake-up call for many African nations. This removal of US aid, for instance, has passively led to the reduction of even soft power influences of the West currently taking place within the continent, which leaves a current space taking place for us to take back that narrative and take back that influence. Because the negative implications of development agencies and foreign dependency is very real and very evident. And simultaneously with the negative implications of the colonial legacy has not been for the well-being of the continent in the past. We see even with the example of Eritrea as a nation removing US aid back in 2005 in an effort of self-sufficiency and an effort of self-sovereignty being a movement that is happening proactively today. Renegotiation of current government contracts and economic businesses will also further contribute towards the shift taking place. We see across the continent, but particularly in West Africa, with the current presidency that recently took place in Senegal, rewriting many government contracts, and the bold and powerful efforts that are taking place across the Sahel states today. It's very clear that no one will prioritize the best interest and economic mobility of our people than the people themselves. And that is why self-sufficiency and self-sovereignty is so important to highlight in regards to this shift in inclusive economic measures. Another contributor towards this shift is the focus on mobilizing the very powerful diaspora force and the resources that they provide. The African Diaspora Network, for instance, led by Almaz Nagash, has recently conducted a study that highlights how much more of a substantial force remittances play in economic development and mobility on the continent than development funding has by USAID from the last 10 years. There's power in the numbers that exist across the African diaspora. Within my home country alone of Eritrea, the diaspora makes up 1/8 of the total Eritrean presence in the world. These numbers are very powerful across the African diaspora, and it is a very clear path towards mobilizing inclusive economic dependencies. Beyond simply as senders of remittances, however, many in the diaspora can serve as partners in investing, in scaling SMEs, and in knowledge transfer. Many African founders are even being mobilized more now than ever with the simultaneous entrepreneurial efforts that are taking place across the diaspora and even domestically on the continent. While these efforts are noble and while they're very important as we see further economic mobility taking place within entrepreneurship, it is important to also highlight the importance of not overemphasizing the importance of entrepreneurship and continuing to put efforts towards improving current economic infrastructures to ensure that the formal sector continues to revolutionize simultaneously. As it's currently believed, about 80% of employment on the continent takes place within the informal sector. But these collective dialogues and solutions are taking place actively and will continue to take place as efforts are being mobilized across the development world. Across even the dialogues are taking place in conferences with many academic institutions from Harvard, Yale, the University of Pennsylvania, where these conversations are highlighting the importance of leveraging the diaspora and furthering more inclusive economic development on the continent. Because it's very important and is being highlighted how important these measures are and they're being emphasized. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So as we trying to wrap it up, I would like to hear if there's any comment, any question from our online audience.
Olivia, there are no questions yet in the Q&A, but I have sent a message encouraging participants to post the questions. I think maybe we could still give it another 5 minutes to see if anybody wishes to raise, also the possibility of raising their hands maybe, and we could then manage it from there. Thank you, and over.
Okay. I can see there's a Angelique. Angelique from Seychelles wants to raise a question. Please, Madam Angelique, join. You can ask your question. Someone can you let her have access to the mic?
Yes, I've allowed her access to the mic.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. So thank you, VP Mutesi. Hi, everyone from Seychelles. So I'm very interested in the conversation and the input of all the panelists. I think it's very interesting. And coming from academia, I think I can relate a lot more to what VP Bora was saying about how we need to encourage research on these areas and ensure that it is encapsulated, it is there, it is accessible. And I believe that one thing that we should a step further is ensuring the access of information to the most remote areas of Africa. Because if we're talking about, you know, we need to know the history, then I believe that getting this information to even the most remote parts of Africa is very important. In the language, that is very important as well, so that they can understand. And incentivizing young people, even on the grassroots level, to undertake research at a very basic level will encourage our youths when they do grow up and undertake university, that they do go into a more focused area of Africa. So for example, when you look at the law area of research, we tend to focus a lot on the European, British, Western side of the law. And our research, our dissertation very much mirrors what is being said already. And if we were to undertake research in a particular area in Africa, the access to information that we would currently need is lacking. And so we tend to shy away from it because we cannot spend most of our time trying to find information. It's very challenging. So I believe there needs to be a movement, which I think has started, but a movement to ensure that data is collected at every point where there is a meeting, international meeting data must be collected, it must be presented, and in a space that is accessible. So I think that is my intervention. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, and I look forward to hearing your opinions and perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is anyone else? I can see Allen. Asimwe Allen. Could you please give access to Asimwe Allen to ask her question?
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Mutesi and the team for the opportunity. My name is Allen Asimwe from Uganda, and I work for a philanthropy support organization called Civ Legacy Foundation. So I'm curious on what opinions the panel have on what direct role young people can play in the current discourse and conversation around decolonizing aid and reparations on African countries, given the power, political, and leadership dynamic that we have. Leadership participation, for example, of young people in Uganda is still not at a percentage where we would like. Levels of decision making are still at a lower scale, like we would imagine. So some of these recommendations at times require resources, require power, require a high level of decision making that young people may not have, or biggest demographic of people that we are talking about may not have, or even the resource to decide. I think one of the panelists alluded to the need to have the resource and power to be able to make certain decisions and actionable results. Some of the resources, of course, used to, promote this whole narrative around reparation and doing differently for African countries. It's still aid resource. So at times I'm left to wonder whose narrative are we pushing? Is it African-led? Is it young people-led? Is it women? All the other minority groups that exist. So whose narrative are we pushing? So any person on the panel can help respond and clearly guide on some of the strategic and actionable things that young people can do that are within their means and resource and power to push forward this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is anyone else in the online audience?
There is a question on the Q&A or in the chat from Toko. How can we join the African Union?
Okay, that was VP Bora. That's yours. So in the meantime, I think we should have those three questions answered. One from Seychelles, another one from Uganda, and another one how to join the Pan-African Youth Union. So I'll start with you, BP Bora, about the research from Seychelles.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. I think the question from Angelique from Seychelles, and greetings to you. I think it wasn't really a question; it was more of a comment, and I think I agree with her. There needs to be a movement that data is collected at every meeting. We need to start compiling data. Africans should have data on Africa. Most of the data that we have are coming from NGOs and international organizations, and we need to have statistics centers. I know a lot of African countries in ERC, we have an institute that's in charge of keeping statistics, but even there it needs to be funded. There needs to be more capacity building, and we need to trust our universities more and more, our scholars more and more to do those jobs. I think most of the time we do not give the benefit of the doubt to our own institutions. The government should be working with the universities in order to ensure that not only we have an adequate educational system, but also that we are keeping track of the data in our country. So I definitely agree with that. Should I go into the two others, or you would like somebody else to jump in?
Can we have Yovala's opinion?
Yes, so I agree with those sentiments in regards to the question produced by the Seychelles. I think it's very important points. In regards to the question from the lady from Uganda, pleasure to meet you. I think talking about which narratives are being pushed is very important not to dilute or reduce identities as individual silos. Oftentimes, many narratives are intersectional. When you talk about pushing the narrative of Africans versus the narratives of women versus the narratives of youth, there are young African women. So you have the intersectional narratives that simultaneously can be pushed collectively, and that when you move with the intersectional, intergenerational approach, it allows for more innovative, collaborative, and transformational solutions to be produced. So rather than certain narratives in silos, looking at the power, at the intergenerational and the intersectional narratives that are out there and that do exist, and that should be at the out of touch in pushing for young people within their government systems. I think when it can feel like, reaching those that are in politics, in political leadership. You all hear me? I'm hearing a bad noise.
We can hear you.
Okay. So oftentimes when it feels like influence for young people on the political leadership scale can be out of touch, rather than looking at a top-bottom approach, looking more so from a bottom-up approach and bottom-up development. The mobilization of youth through grassroots mobilization, the development of NGOs where we are working with youth and we're putting efforts on the ground that are doing the work that is influencing passively, whether through policy reform or through mobilization of young people, is a very powerful tool that I feel at times can mind, but yet still exists, and is another route for young people to be taking, and that young people are taking. Earlier, I mentioned the UN ECOSOC Youth Forum that took place at the headquarters 2-3 weeks ago. I was able to attend and meet with many young people from across the continent who have taken it upon themselves to not only pinpoint a problem they see in their environment, but to do something about it, and have started these organizations, have started these NGOs who are doing the work on the ground and have taken it upon themselves to leverage and spotlight the work they're doing in a platform as big as the United Nations. When that work is being done, like, it'll speak for itself, and that passive impact will take place over time. So even if one is not able to be in the decision-making room, while those simultaneous efforts are being taking place by young people, as I mentioned, the youngest minister in a parliament or in a government body right now on the continent is in Namibia, who she is as young as 27, I believe. Simultaneously, these grassroots mobilization and these grassroots efforts are just as powerful in producing that change for young people.
Thank you. Thank you. So as we wrap up our conversation, I would like to have a few round of closing questions in form of call for action. To you, Bora, as someone who comes from DRC, in the country that has suffered too much of colonial mistreatment, and it's still going on. How can youth, civil society, and culture institutions like UNESCO collaborate to promote healing, justice, and transformation?
Sorry, could you repeat that? How can the civil society like UNESCO? Is that what you said?
Yeah, no, how can youth, civil society, culture institutions like UNESCO collaborate to promote healing, justice, and transformation?
To promote, collaborate.
How can youth, civil society, and culture institutions like UNESCO collaborate to promote healing, justice, and transformation?
Yes. Thank you. I think this is what Uvela was saying. It needs to be intersectional and intergenerational. It will call on everyone to promote healing, justice, and transformation. But I think the first step is to recognize that is something that was done wrong. There's been a discussion on the price tag on reparation. How much would it cost? And because of that, many countries are even scared to recognize something that they have done, because they believe that, okay, if there's a political recognition that there was a wrongdoing, then there needs to be compensation or reparation, and they're fearing that. However, they're not fearing, or at least they're enjoying the perks of that past, that dark past. What we are asking today, and this is what I would ask civil society, young people, cultural institutions like UNESCO, is to have an open discussion, not only in Africa, but also in those former colonial powers, to have discussion not only with the diaspora, but with everyone, to encourage, and this is what UNESCO can actually play a big role when it comes to education, to encourage the teaching of the responsibility of former colonial powers. And as I said at the beginning, we are not here to blame or to shame. We are just here to state facts and to move forward. We need reconciliations so that we're not scared of each other. Because when you're scared of somebody, then you start to act in a very unpredictable way. And that's where we create division. I grew up in Belgium. I discovered racism in Belgium, right? And that is something that you must go through, because there's not a discussion of why is this black kid in Belgium? Why am I in Belgium? Why do we have African American in the United States? Why do we have a lot of African American black people in the West Indies? So as long as we do not address those questions, as long as there's not a national debate on the responsibilities of the states, of European states, American states, into the slave trade, into breaking and destroying communities in Africa, into looting and continuously looting African resources, then there will not be any reconciliation or any healing, and justice will not be served. For justice to be served, for healing and for transformation, we need to talk. We need to have an open discussion where everyone actually put on the big boy pant or big lady pant and they accept their responsibilities and we move forward. There's something I had said a couple of years ago. I said, being a racist is not a disease. You can't die from it. It's just ignorance. And once you start talking to people, you can learn better and be better. So that's what I will encourage the civil society to do and UNESCO. And I think UNESCO can play a big part into this. I'm just afraid that if it does it, it might not be funded again. Thank you.
Thank you, VP Bora, for that insightful comment. I would like to move to Yevola as we are closing our conversation today. What is one of the concrete action young people can take today to honor the past while building a more just and equitable future?
Thank you for that question. I was kind of able to touch on this a bit earlier, but I think in regards to looking at youth as the answer, like the youth is already the answer. The youth is already doing the work. In regards to, like I mentioned, with grassroots mobilizing, identifying issues that are on the ground and taking it upon themselves to be a part of that solution, being the change they wish to see, not waiting for an outside entity, an outside organization, outside government agency to provide the money where the mouth is. It will allow for youth to play a more proactive role in that change, to provide for a more just future. And I think it's, not sitting back and looking for that savior, but I wouldn't say that is the case even right now. We see these forums and these conversations taking place within the diaspora. I kind of spoke on this earlier, I've sat in on some of these African development conferences that are talking about the youth are the answer, the youth are the answer. It's beyond simply saying the youth are the answer and listening to what the youth have to say, because the youth have a lot to say and the youth are putting the work on the ground. So I think the continuous efforts that are actively taking place, a lot of these agencies, beyond providing talking points on what the youth are doing, putting where their mouth are, but not solely depending on that, but being a part of that, even and it's not dependent solely on the youth on the ground. We see this efforts taking place across the youth in the diaspora. I personally, growing up as an Eritrean American, based in Florida, where there's not a lot of Eritreans even in Florida, there's mobilization through these organizations like the National Council of Eritrean Americans, where active efforts are taking place on the ground to conduct community service, to meet in community, to provide not only fundraising to fund efforts back home, but efforts being placed where youth are going back to Eritrea and taking part in lending their skills, lending their expertise, lending their qualifications and their academics towards volunteering in ministries that align with their academic background, and furthering this effort not of brain drain, but of brain gain, and returning back to the continent, returning back to your home countries, and working collaboratively with youth that are on the ground. These efforts are taking place, but for it to continue, we will begin and we will further see substantive solutions being provided for these legacies of colonialization and even neo-colonialization that's actively taking place.
Thank you so much, Yevola. So I would like to invite, there are some few people who raise their hands. One is I think Sebastian. Sebastio. Is he still online? And now then it's Joanna. Can we have them?
Yes. Can you hear me? Good afternoon.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Sebastian Pirch. I had a question for the director, but I'm not sure he's still around.
Okay. Go on. But I think it will be transmitted to him.
Okay, but if he's not around, I can definitely ask a question.
We have Madam Waswa. She can come in for the director. Madam Waswa, please allow us to invite you to answer the question on behalf of the director. Is that okay?
I'm going to direct my question directly to the good brother that's from the DRC, because the question I wanted to ask the director was connected to the speech that he gave. So I think it would be more appropriate if the person answering the question.
No, Madame Mwaswa works with the author, with the office.
No problem.
The director, so I think she's in the position to answer that question. Please feel
All
free
right.
to direct the question to her.
Yes, Madam Moderator, that's fine. You ask the question and then we see from also the panelists if they can chime in as well, so that we have
Great.
a conversation that cuts across. That's fine. Yeah.
Perfect.
Please go ahead.
Perfect. So I want to know the director's conclusive thoughts on why it is essential for Africans to understand and take ownership of their workflows, first of all, and additionally, also wanted to have his view on whether colonial institutional legacies are holding Africa back, and if democracy by default does not suit the African context today. This is the first question. And the second question is for the brother from the DRC. I apologize, I forget his name. I think Brother Bora. So I wanted to ask if Pan-Africanism today, right, according to him, since Africans through tribalism find it very difficult to unite behind the nation, the idea of nation state. How can Africans unite behind the idea of Pan-Africanism, Africa, if within a country, right, we are not able sometimes to unite? So that's what I wanted to ask. These are the two questions.
Should I go first on that one, on the last one? Yeah. All right. Thank you. Thank you, brother. I think if I understand your question correctly, you're saying since it's it's difficult to have a nation state because of tribalism, how can Africa unite behind the idea of Pan-Africanism?
That is
so.
right.
Yeah. Thank you. So at the creation of the African Union itself, there were two groups. You had the group of Moravia and the group of Casablanca. The group of Moravia had this idea of Pan-Africanism, which was we each sort out our countries individually, and then once we are, we are okay, then we can meet in this big group called African Organization of African Unity. And then you had the group of Casablanca, which has another idea, which was let's help each other fight colonialism or neo-colonialism. Let's ensure that each country is free from foreign interference before we deal with our own internal issues, right? And unfortunately, or fortunately for those, the ideology that won was the ideology of Moravia, which meant that Pan-Africanism, as it was understood through the creation of the Organization of African Unity, was that I'm DRC. I'll first deal with problems in DRC. We have a secession taking place. I am Guinea. I'll deal with Guinea. I'm Senegal. I'll deal with Senegambia and all of that. That was the main issue when it comes to Pan-Africanism on the continent. And I understand, we can understand how that flowed into our perception of Pan-Africanism today. Pan-Africanism is not a fixed state. It's a philosophy that evolves with the cultures on the continent. It is something that brings us together as brothers. And this is why we shouldn't look at our difficulties of uniting tribes in our own country to challenge the whole idea of Pan-Africanism. I think the fact that we are able to still have countries, nations, although they're not the best, or at least not the way that we would want them to be, but we still have countries that are fighting people that are united in our different countries. I'm from DRC. We have more than 250 tribes and languages, right? How do you unite 250 languages, 250 tribes? But we are managing, right? It's a big challenge, but we are managing. The fact that we haven't broken apart also shows that there's some resilience in the people, because there comes a point where people do not necessarily look at who's your grandfather, who's your grandmother. They just look at you as the classmate or the love interest or the colleagues, etc. In those 250 ethnic groups that we have in DRC, we've divided them into four linguistic groups. We have the Swahilis, we have the Kikongo, we have the Lingala, and we have the Luba, right? So those who speak Kiswahili, those who speak Lingala, those who speak Chiluba, and those who speak Kikongo. So those four groups are not four ethnical groups. What we've been able to do is to unite a particular geographical linguistic group into one, right? So I'd say that we are having, of course, trouble differences and trouble difficulties, but that is not preventing us from leaving Pan-Africanism. And as Mutesi said it earlier, I'm from Goma. Goma is a vibrant city. In Goma, you have Rwandese, Congolese, Ugandans, you have Tanzanians, South Sudanese, Senegalese, you have South Africans, Zambians, you have Moroccan, you have everyone. And that is also what Pan-Africanism is. So being able to find yourself in one place and sharing the food from your country while listening to Fally Ipupa, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people know Fally Ipupa, that's also part of Pan-Africanism. You know, being able to listen to Fally Ipupa in Uganda, listen to Asake in South Africa, listen to Sheb Mami in Ethiopia and Eritrea. So all of that's also what shape our unity. But I do understand where your question comes from. It was our failure at the beginning of creating our common institution to have the one that speaks the most to the people and not speaks the most to the countries. Thank you. I hope I was able to answer your question, brother. I tend to go into lengthy explanations sometimes.
Yes, Brother Bora, thank you very much for your answer.
Yes, perhaps I will not be able to give the comprehensive answer for you, as the question was directed to the director, who unfortunately had to go to another meeting. But maybe I may just continue from where VP Bora stopped, to indicate that in life, diversity must be pride we take into who we are. Because being homogeneous as we are being featured, we are everywhere, yet we all have our strengths as Africans, as individual tribes, as human beings. So I think we should start looking at diversity as a strength, not a weakness. And then starting from there, then it's possible for us to embrace who we are and then move forward. Just to endeavor to answer the question you had about, perhaps you're alluding it to governance on the continent, yes?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's to say that, what we as Africans are looking for is the dignity as individuals, as Africans. If we take that word to have that dignity as individuals, as human beings, it won't matter which kind of a government that we have on the continent, because it's about also ownership. The continent and the Africans, the call is to have ownership of our natural resources, human resources, so that it's possible for the leaders on the continent to infuse those resources into developing the continent. And the main framework that the African Union endeavored to put together is the Agenda 2063. That was a framework looking at entirety of who Africa could look like if the Africans owned their resources. So what is important moving forward and where we are with this conversation is to ensure that Africans are given the dignity we need, as well as ownership of the resources, which includes human and natural resources, so that we are able to transform our continent and to develop the citizens within the continent to have the dignity as human beings. Thanks, Madam Moderator. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Madam Mwaswa, for that intervention. So I think we have had, everyone has spoken, and we would love to wrap up our conversation. I would like to call VP Bora to give to round it up, to give us a take home as young people. As also, I would like to, I'll call Madam Waswa on behalf of OSA to come and give a wrap up. And would also I would come and give a vote of thanks. Thank you so much. VP Bora to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This was really, really refreshing. I like being in these type of spaces where we discuss among ourselves our destiny, our future. I'd like to call these some sort of a family reunion, and these are really, really nice. Just missing some food, but perhaps next time we meet in New York, we'll be able to have a cookout and have this discussion in a more even more engaging way. So thank you for tuning in and for participating. Thank you for your questions. Justice for African and people of African descent through reparation is a topic that requires from us a lot of strategy, unity, and collaboration. It is a topic that will be addressed, as Yovela said earlier, in an intergenerational and intersectional way. So we should not let this discussion just be another one. This should be a continuity of what we're already doing individually. And perhaps this should be the point where we do come together as young people, civil society, and institutions to enable the next generation to make the change that we were hoping to see a few years ago, that we're hoping to enact ourselves. I'd like to thank you, VP Oliver, for moderating these sessions and for guiding us through this with a lot of skills. And I'd like to thank OSA and all the partners for giving us a platform to actually exchange among African youth, to talk about things that matters to us, things of yesterday, today, and of tomorrow. And of course, I'd like to thank the Pan-African Union for the work that it's doing. Sounds like I'm thanking myself, but I'm actually thanking the organization and all the young people who work tirelessly every day for the African liberation, for the Africa we want, the African renewal. And that is very important to acknowledge everyone. And there was a question earlier about how can you join the Pan-African Union? Join grassroots organization in your country. And those are linked to the National Councils, and the National Council is linked to the Pan-African Union. Mutesi and myself being here and having titles as Vice President, that should not impress you. Whatever job you're doing is perhaps even more important than the job that we do. And it's very important for you to own up to what you're doing and to make sure that it is known, it is heard of, and we'll make sure that we amplify that for you and we accompany you. So my words here are just words of thanks, and I yield the floor back. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I would request Madam Juliet Waswa, on behalf of OSA, to give a closing remark. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Yes. Perhaps for me, the closing remark is to say that we appreciate you all for the staying engaged in how to move the needle forward in Africa's development, that we first must be inclusive. Inclusivity means, as one of the participants alluded to ensure that there is a reach that goes beyond the urban to the rural areas to the deepest part of the countries, so that nobody's left behind. And we thank you for being available to take part in this conversation. And of course, putting it in the way that this week for Africa Dialogue series is looking at the history. But there is a chain between the history, the present, where we are, and the future. And these are the conversations that we've put together to make sure that this week we are looking at the history and how we connect to the future next week, to the present next week, and then the future the third week. So we trust that you will also be able to join us in those conversations so that we amplify the message about what we need to do, not to look at others, but us as Africans and you as the youth, to move the process forward. And of course, as it was put by Yovela, that we must do what we can where we are. You see a problem, you look for solution. And we appreciate that this is exactly the message that has come out of this conversation today. Thanks very much, and keep up with keeping up. It's not easy, but we have to do it together collectively. It's a joint effort. Thank you. Over to Madam Moderator. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our OSA, our hosts, because they are the ones that have put this space together. I want to thank you for supporting the young people on all fronts and having us included in these conversations. It means a lot to us. It means that we are considered to have a contribution to this continent or to even global opinion. We appreciate you a lot. I would also want to appreciate our panelists. Thank you so much for coming through and having this very fruitful conversation. I would also want to thank our online audience for tuning in and keeping us with us and also engaging. Thank you so much, and allow me to end this conversation here. May God bless you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.